Good morning. Good morning. Yom HaShoah is 5th of May this year, and I do want to remind people that we do have a communal Yom HaShoah commemoration, which this year, it moves around synagogues in the county. This year it will be at B'nai Shalom at 3:30 on May 5th. We're going to begin with an art project that's curated by some very talented people, and then program proper will start a little bit after 4, and it should be a meaningful program as well. I do want to say, I want to remind everyone that if your phones are on, this would be a good time to turn them off, as I am modeling. So, and I do want to say that we're really grateful that Rachel Klingfeld, Rachel, will you stand, please? Please. Rachel Klingfeld has taken the lead in organizing programs over the last number of years for our community. And it's this is the kind of volunteering that is we really deeply appreciate, because it comes from a place of deep caring and a desire to do something for the community that enriches all of us. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. So today, we're really grateful for our Yom HaShoah program to have with us Ezra Bretler. Ezra is the grandson of Holocaust survivors. His grandfather, Karl Rossner, was born in Hamburg, Germany, and his grandmother, Frieda Zeitschnur Rossner, was born in Vilna, in Poland. Karl and his family, despite moving to Paris, returned to Hamburg, where they were living on the night of the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, in 1938. And Karl's youngest brother, Elliot, survived on the Kindertransport and remained in Belgium until the end of the war. After surviving orphanages, old age homes, and hospitals, Karl and his brother, Wolfgang, were sent to Buchenwald, the concentration camp Buchenwald, and were liberated at the end of the war in 1945. His grandmother was the only child of wealthy parents. When her family was sent to the ghetto in Vilna, the Vilnius ghetto, they put Frieda in a burlap sack and threw her over the ghetto wall. That's how she survived. And her parents later managed to escape as well and were hidden by a farmer until the end of the war. The focus today is mostly going to be on Ezra's grandfather. And Ezra says that, and you'll hear from him, of course, but he says that he's always felt a special family connection to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. He has fond memories of playing chess with his grandfather, who died 2 years ago. And he feels a responsibility to explore and know and share every part of his story. And I want to say that it's really a blessing that Ezra feels so connected to his lineage and his story. And I just want to share that his story is our story. Their stories are the story of our people. It's not often that we get to learn about Jewish history, contemporary Jewish history, from people who heard these stories from the survivors themselves. Ezra speaks now because he wants all of us, and especially students, to feel a real living connection to the Shoah. He wants them to know without a doubt that this is history, this has happened, and hopes that his grandfather's story will give a face to the 6 million. And we're grateful to have Ezra here. And I want to say we've invited our 6th and 7th grade classes to be here with us this morning, as well as our madrichim, to bear witness and to learn firsthand. And I want to thank all of you for coming this morning. Without any further ado, Ezra Brettler.
Thank you, Rabbi Dan, for those introductory words. A few quick words about myself. I live in Berkeley, so not too far away. I've been in the Bay Area for the last 10 years. I work at YouTube. For the 6th and 7th graders, how many of you use YouTube a lot? So I'm not going to be talking about YouTube today, but maybe at the end, if you have questions, we can talk about that. But I'm going to be speaking with all of you today about my grandfather, Karl Rosner. If we go to the next slide, this is just a little bit about JFCS Holocaust Center, the organization that I'm here as part of, that makes it part of their mission to educate about the Holocaust and genocide. So if we keep moving, here we go. So my grandfather and I, we always had a really close relationship. I always looked forward to going to his house as a young kid. If I'm being totally honest, the fact that he was very generous with the sweets probably helped. A lot of gummy bears, a lot of chocolate. Here's a photo of him that was taken 10 years ago in 2014, actually the last one, with all 6 of his grandchildren. 2 years ago, as Rabbi Dan mentioned, my grandfather passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by his family at the age of 93. But I know that he'd be really happy to know that his story is continuing to be told, even though he's no longer with us. So over the years, as Rabbi Dan referenced, my grandfather, he taught me many things about life, but one of the first things he taught me was how to play chess. His mother had taught him to play around the same time that he learned to read. So at a very young age, he learned to play chess. And he was eager to pass that knowledge along to me. Grandpa, he would always win. He didn't take it easy on me. And at the end of each game, he would often point to a fork in the road moment, a move where one wrong decision, usually a wrong decision I had made, really had dramatically altered the course of the game. And the fact that he grew up playing chess, it might make it seem like he had a pretty normal childhood, but I, of course, wouldn't be speaking with all of you today if that were the case. So I'm going to share with you all today the story of how he survived the brutality of the Nazi regime as a Jewish teen living in Germany without any parents looking out for him. So that's kind of a unique thing about his story that I'll get into. And in that story, there were many fork-in-the-road moments where things could have easily gone very differently, where my grandfather's life was quite literally hanging in the balance. Yes, like all survivors, he was extremely lucky, but also there were several extraordinary people who stepped up to help him in really critical ways over the course of his youth. And I want to leave you with a key learning that you might take from my grandfather's story. The learning is that there's a tremendous power in seeing the humanity in others and acting to help those in need, regardless of what the government says or what terrible position you might be in yourself. And before I dive into the story, I want to share a brief video from spring 2020. So we'll play the video. He was about 91 at the time this video was recorded. So by that time, he was already slowing down a bit. It's not his best energy level, but I want you to hear his voice and to meet him virtually.
Hi, I'm Karl H. Rosner. I was born in Hamburg, Germany, and I'm very happy to be in the United States now, which I think is still the best country in the world. My wife and I were very happy coming here when we were both young. He had all our children here, and I am lucky enough to still be alive after all the trials and tribulations that I've had in my youth. I think it's an example of somebody who's been lucky enough to survive, but yet has been exposed to all the terrible things that Germany as a civilized country has done to kill 6 million Jews, of which in particularly I'm very, very sad. They included 1.5 million children from infants to teenagers. And it is important that the world knows what a civilized country can do and has done, so that it never ever happens again by people hearing the story from somebody who's been surviving it and yet is still terrified and traumatized by what has happened to him.
So I know my grandfather had a pretty factual tone in that video, but as he mentioned at the end, what happened to him was really incredibly traumatic. And he gave you a preview of what made his childhood so difficult, but I'll be going into much more detail. So my grandfather, whose full name is Karl-Heinz Rosner, was born in Hamburg, Germany on April 4th, 1929. At that time, there were about 1.1 million people living in Hamburg, so it was a fairly big city. It was one of the largest cities in Germany, a little bigger than San Francisco and Berkeley combined. And my grandfather was the eldest of 3 boys in a middle-class family. So here's a photo with him and his 2 younger brothers. If we go to the next slide, his mother, Rahel, was an entrepreneur. She owned a bedding store, which we have a picture of on the slide here. And my grandfather was just 3 years old when Hitler rose to power on January 30th, 1933. And 1 year after that, my grandfather's maternal grandfather, the one in this passport photo, his name was Gershon Hausner, he saw that things were starting to get worse for Jews in Germany and decided pretty quickly to move to Palestine, an area that's now called Israel. Who knows when was Israel founded? What was the year?
1949 or 47.
Yeah, it was 1948, but it did take a little while for things to be kind of solidified. So yeah, that was about 15 years after Hitler rose to power. This was 1933. At the time, the area was controlled by the British. Much of my grandfather's extended family, they followed to Palestine. Many other Jews from across Europe fled there as well in the 1930s. Some folks tried to go there but weren't able to make it there. My grandfather's parents, however, they decided to stay in Hamburg. And soon after that, my grandfather's mother gave up her business as Jews were pressured to close or even sell their businesses throughout the mid-1930s. At the same time, they were stripped of many other fundamental rights. And around that same time, my grandfather's parents got divorced. That was maybe why they didn't go to Israel or Palestine at the time. They were going through some things. And his father returned back to Romania, where he had originally been born. And so my grandfather Carl's mother, Rahel, she then took her 3 young children to Paris, if we go to the next slide. When my grandfather was 5 or 6 years old, one of her brothers had moved there, and she thought it would be safer in Paris. But unfortunately, she didn't speak much French. And that proved to be a major obstacle in finding a job and kind of making ends meet economically. So in 1935 or 1936, she made the really tough choice to return back to Germany with her boys. Now, Carl's mother wasn't born in Germany, but she moved there when she was 2 years old, and she had really grown to admire German culture in the years before Hitler rose to power. Jews in Germany at the time were pretty assimilated. Germany had the highest literacy rate in the world at that time. So although things had become difficult for Jews there, she couldn't begin to imagine the awful reality of what would come to pass in the next 10 years. If we go to the next slide, one more. So, one major hint of the horrors to come came the night of November 9th, 1938, when my grandfather was just 9 years old. It was a couple months after this photo was taken. Can anyone, any of the 6th or 7th graders, can any of them explain what happened on Kristallnacht, or the night of the broken glass? Any brave volunteers? Yep.
Like shops were like broken into and like there's like fire and stuff and a lot of people were getting killed.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thank you. Yeah, just to repeat what he said, and maybe summarize it a little bit. So on this night, and continuing the next day, the Nazis, they lit fire, as you mentioned, to several hundred synagogues. They smashed the windows of Jewish businesses, and around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested for no reason other than their religion, and they were imprisoned in concentration camps. And just to give a quick definition, a concentration camp, it's a place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are imprisoned in an intentionally small area that doesn't have adequate facilities. And sometimes that's done to provide forced labor or to await mass execution. And so my grandfather, he remembered, if we go to the next slide, he remembered walking to his Jewish school that day. It's the school, there's the school. School pictured in this photo, and rather than having a regular school day, the teachers told them all to assemble in the hall, and they were greeted by some German officers there who yelled at them very harshly. They intimidated them. This event, it's also referred to as the Night of Broken Glass because of the shards of glass that littered the streets of Jewish neighborhoods after all these attacks on Jewish businesses and synagogues. And today in Germany, where learning about the Holocaust is a really big part of elementary and high school education, they're preferring to use the phrase "night of pogroms." Rabbi Dan used that phrasing too, rather than Kristallnacht. They now feel that Kristallnacht, at the time, it was really a propaganda term to try to minimize what had happened. Oh, it's just some broken glass. Nothing too horrible happened that night. And the new phrasing better kind of links what happened to the violent pogroms or the attacks by mobs of ordinary citizens against Jews, which also happened in Europe in the centuries before the Holocaust. And so the Night of Pogroms, it was a really horrible event, but still no one at that point would have dreamed of the horrors of gas chambers being used to kill Jewish men, women, and even children. And if we go to the next slide, unlike some of the later Nazi atrocities, many of which were kept secret until after World War II was over, or almost over, there was a lot of international coverage of the Night of Pogroms, like in the article featured here. So it wasn't a secret that this happened. And one direct result of this, if we go to the next slide, was an effort called the Kindertransport. That translates to children's transport. It was an effort led primarily by a group of British Jewish charities to save Jewish children living in Germany by transporting them to live with foster families in England. And the first group of nearly 200 children, they arrived in England just 3 weeks after the Night of Pogroms. So it happened pretty quickly. There was a sense of urgency to do something after the Night of Pogroms. And in the following 9 months, almost 10,000 mainly Jewish children traveled alone for the hours-long train and boat ride to England. And often these children were the only ones in their entire extended families that ultimately survived the Holocaust. And so as Rabbi Dan mentioned, my grandfather's youngest brother, Elliot, he was fortunate enough to secure a spot on one of these transports. Generally, younger children were given priority. And he was one of about 500 children that was sent to live in Sweden rather than England. And my grandpa Carl's mother, Rahel, she was worried about her youngest son. She was able to smuggle herself into Sweden so that she could keep an eye on him over there. And so she then placed my grandfather and his middle brother, Joseph Wolfgang, in a Jewish orphanage and worked really hard to try to get them visas so that they could reunite, so that they too could come to Sweden. So my grandfather and his brother, they were suddenly separated from their mom when they were just 9 and 8 years old. Their dad wasn't around, as I mentioned. Their dad was in Romania, so they were on their own. It had been an extremely challenging several years for them, but at least they had their mother there by their side, a responsible adult making decisions for them. looking out for them, offering the comfort that only a parent can provide. But suddenly they were separated from their mom. They were placed in a strange new environment. I guess I want to strike a balance when I describe the orphanage, because it was actually like a pretty positive place for my grandfather, where, as I'll talk about, he had a lot of friends, and there were some amazing teachers there, but he was separated from his parents. So if we go to the next slide, World War II officially started at the beginning of September in 1939. And as the war progressed, the Nazis, they increased the severity of the policies which discriminated against Jews. And in September 1941, when my grandfather was 11, the Jews of Germany had to start wearing badges which said Jude, or it's pronounced Jude in German. That means Jewish in German. And this was to highlight that they were Jewish. They did not have equal rights, and they should be treated as lesser than ordinary Germans. And after the war, my grandfather was able to actually recover his personal badge that he wore during this time, which is the one pictured here. And the Nazis, they would soon conquer a great deal of territory where the Jews of Europe were living. Everything in dark gray there was controlled by the Nazis. And they started to explore and implement more extreme options for how to kill the Jews living in these areas, particularly in Poland and Ukraine. There were really big Jewish communities. And as many of you know, the Nazi goal was to establish an empire made up of a pure Aryan race, without groups like Jews, who they considered to be racially inferior. So if we go to the next slide, my grandfather and Wolfgang, meanwhile, they made the most of their difficult situation. They made friends with the other young boys at the orphanage. This is my grandfather here with a friend of his named Sigmar. And one of my grandfather's favorite activities at the orphanage was playing chess with the other children. He also did a lot of reading to satisfy his curiosity, and also just to kind of keep tabs on everything that was going on with the war, to educate himself about the latest events. And by the way, my grandfather's brother, everyone called him by his nickname at the time, Wolfie. So I'll just call him Wolfie too, moving forward. Next, we have one more video. Let me just give a little background before we play it. This is from 2021. In this video, he revisits his memory from a specific memory from the orphanage. The director of the orphanage received a special hard-boiled egg each day. It was a special ration, since he was a veteran of World War I. And the director would share a small section of that egg with a different child at the orphanage each day. So we'll play the video. Just taking a second to load. I have to pass the feedback on to my colleagues at YouTube that sometimes it can be a little slow. Let's see. We might have to skip it, I suppose. Yeah, if you do it this way, maybe it'll be better.
He cut off the top of the egg and then gave it in turn, circulated around the table. One day each boy got it in turn, and he then took it and scooped it out and got it, and then the next day got the next turn, and he ate it. And so that was a favor that the director gave in turn to the next boy, and he scooped it out and ate it.
So they would kind of circulate this treat, this little slice of egg. This was during wartime when there wasn't so much food, so it was really a special thing. And there were 30 or 35 children total in the orphanage, so each child would get this treat about once a month. In the spring of 1942, my grandfather had his bar mitzvah at the orphanage. Have any of the 6th or 7th graders, have any of you had your bar mitzvah yet? Or are you preparing for it now, I imagine? A couple people who have either had it or are preparing, so you know what that's about. By this time, in the spring of 1942, already 2 million Jews had been killed in Poland and Ukraine. And for most American Jews, this thing of being a bar mitzvah, it's purely symbolic, or it's mostly symbolic. Sorry, Rabbi Dan. You're becoming kind of a man or woman in the eyes of the community, but your parents are still continuing to take care of your needs. They're still paying for your smartphone bill. They're driving you around. They're doing all sorts of other things to kind of take care of you for some time after your bar mitzvah. But my grandfather, he wasn't a typical 13-year-old. His parents were living in other countries. He had really taken it upon himself to look after Wolfie for a few years. He was taking on a lot more responsibility than most kids at his age, and he still would have a lot of growing up that he would be forced to do over the next few years. And one memory my grandfather has from his bar mitzvah, this was always very vivid for him, and maybe part of why he always had a lot of sweets in his house, later in life. But somehow the folks running the orphanage, they were able to scrounge up the ingredients to bake a cake for him to celebrate his bar mitzvah, which was no small feat in wartime, where everything was very scarce. But my grandfather was so nervous about having to perform, though, about having to be up here on a bima like this one, reading from the Torah in front of everyone, he completely forgot to eat a slice of this special cake. And he only thought of it, by the time he thought to look for a slice, all of the cake had been eaten, it was all gone. So he was really longing for that slice of cake in the days afterwards. And I'll just note the photo on the right. It shows a man named Julius Hamburger, who had helped my grandfather prepare for his bar mitzvah. Now, just a couple months after my grandfather's bar mitzvah, the Nazis closed his Jewish school, along with the rest of the Jewish schools throughout Germany, in June of 1942. And in July of that year, the last of the remaining children living in the Jewish orphanage, so the children pictured in these photos, they were loaded onto a truck and they were sent to concentration camps. And on the right, I've included a partial list of children and staff from the orphanage, along with the concentration camps that they were deported to from October 1941 to July of 1942. I included an arrow in that photo in the middle to point out my grandfather. I'll note the Nazis, they called them internment camps at the time. It was kind of a euphemism, a way to make it seem like these places weren't as horrible as they truly were. And my grandfather remembers that Julius Hamburger, the teacher who we saw on the last slide, he was part of the group that was sent to Auschwitz in July 1942. And Hamburger took the orphanage's Torah scroll, the same Torah that my grandfather read from for his bar mitzvah, and brought it with him onto the truck. And Julius Hamburger was ultimately murdered at Auschwitz when he was 31 years old. And the moment that this truck pulled away from the orphanage, it was one of the really huge fork in the road moments in my grandfather's story. And that's because my grandfather and Wolfie, they weren't on that truck. They were told they didn't have to go. And my grandfather, he initially begged to go along with his friends. He didn't want to be left out. He didn't understand what getting on that truck would truly mean. But there was a man named Max Plaut, who was head of the Jewish community of Hamburg at the time. He had a better understanding of what this choice really meant. He was forced to interact with the Nazis. And he told them that if they were told that they didn't have to go, they must not go. And as my grandfather mentioned in the short video I played earlier, it's estimated that 1.5 million of the 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust were either children or adolescents. And that fact always really stuck with my grandfather, because that painful knowledge that virtually all of his friends from the orphanage, virtually all of the children pictured here were killed by the Nazis. So it's natural for you to wonder, why didn't my grandpa and Wolfie have to go along with the rest of the other kids to what they were told was an internment camp? Well, my grandfather, his saving grace was his Romanian citizenship. I mentioned before that Carl's father was a Romanian citizen and had actually returned back to Romania after he was divorced from Carl's mother. And since his father was a Romanian citizen, my grandfather and Wolfie were also Romanian citizens. So they were not German citizens. And this was really important because Germany was allied with Romania during that phase of the war. They were on the same side of the war. And Romania, they also took some additional steps to actually protect their Jewish citizens living in Germany. So this meant that at that point in time, Romanian Jews, and therefore my grandfather and Wolfie, they had a special protected status relative to German Jews, or Jews with other foreign citizenships. So that's why they didn't have to go on that truck. They were allowed to stay in Hamburg, where they moved into a Jewish old age home. And they helped in the kitchen. They did some other chores there. And in early 1943, the last of the elderly folks living in the Jewish old age home were sent to a concentration camp. And the two boys were taken in by the married couple pictured here, by Emanuel and Gertrude Seinfeld. This was a couple who had previously worked at the Jewish orphanage. And the Seinfelds, they had sent their daughter Ava to England on the kinder transport in order to protect her. So they had a daughter who they had been forced to send away to protect her. But during this extremely difficult time, when they were struggling to be so far away from their own daughter, and in a wartime period where everyone was having trouble finding enough food for themselves, they took care of my grandfather and Wolfie. They made sure they had enough to eat, as if the boys were their own biological children, which is an amazing thing. And if we go to the next slide, in July of 1943, the U.S. and Great Britain initiated a huge bombing campaign over Hamburg. It lasted for 8 full days. It was called Operation Gemara. And more than half of the city was destroyed in an effort to slow down the production of weapons that were part of the German war effort. So when these big wars, the lines are blurred sometimes. Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? Even the U.S. and Great Britain, the good guys, so to speak, they had this huge bombing campaign that was for a pretty good reason to slow down the war, but there were a lot of civilians who were caught in the collateral damage, and it's estimated that around 35,000 civilians were killed by this bombing. And my grandfather remembers he was huddling in a small basement, he called it a broom closet, with Wolfie and the Seinfelds, and one of those bombing attacks was hitting an area really close to their building. And when the bombing finally stopped that day, he told me they ran out of the building to safety before that little building collapsed. And so once again, it seemed that my grandfather and Wolfie had gotten quite lucky. They managed to avoid being injured. They weren't killed by this huge number of bombs that was being dropped on Hamburg. But as it turns out, this was another fork in the road moment that had really big consequences, because during this time, Karl's mother, Rahel, she was working really hard to try to get the two boys visas so that they too could come to Sweden. And the crazy thing is, Rahel was ultimately successful in that effort. She got those visas approved for the boys in the middle of 1943. We have records of this. But this bombing of Hamburg, it destroyed so much of the infrastructure of the city, including the delivery of mail, that my grandfather and Wolfie never got that notification. They never found out that they had been given permission to go to Sweden. And remember, at this point, there was no internet. There were no cell phones. A postcard in the mail was the only way that Rahel could get in touch with her two eldest boys. And so the Rosner boys, they stayed in Hamburg with the Seinfelds. They had no idea that they had the opportunity to go to Sweden. And in 1943, Wolfie had his bar mitzvah in Hamburg. It was a much more modest affair than my grandpa's bar mitzvah. There weren't any other Jewish children around to celebrate the milestone with. And there was certainly no cake this time around. And then in June of 1944, a couple months after my grandfather had turned 15, it became clear that his and Wolfie's luck had run out. That summer, Romania switched sides in the war. They instead allied with the Soviet Union, and that meant that my grandfather and Wolfie no longer had the special status that had protected them before. It had been more than 5 years since they had last seen their parents, and there was no way for anyone to know this, but at this point, it was only about 1 more year before World War II in Europe officially ended. So this was really towards the end of the war. But if we go to the next slide, the boys were notified that they were being sent to an internment camp called Buchenwald. And even at this late stage in the war, Jewish adults were aware of the rumors When the boys were sent to the camp, there was some correspondence between some of the adults that were looking after them and some of the folks in Sweden. So they kind of knew, okay, this is really bad that they were being sent away. But the teenage boys, they didn't know the true horrible nature of what happened at places like Buchenwald. And the next day, it was just a regular police officer, a regular German police officer who came and arrested them. And they took a regular passenger train to Weimar, which was about a 5-hour drive away. And when they arrived in Weimar, they were held in a local prison there for a few nights. And then a few days later, it started to become a little more clear that there was really, something horrible in store for them, because a cattle car that was filled with prisoners from Eastern Europe stopped in Weimar on the way to Buchenwald. And these trains were called cattle cars because they had been used literally to transport cattle, to transport cows. But now hundreds of prisoners were crammed into these cars. They had no windows, no bathroom facilities. There were so many prisoners packed in that there was no room for anyone to sit down. It was difficult even to breathe. And many prisoners died of sickness or starvation on these cattle car rides before they even arrived at a concentration camp. And the other prisoners that my grandfather encountered, they looked really thin, they looked sick. As you can imagine, it was very scary, but it was only a 5-minute train ride, or 5-mile train ride, from Weimar to Buchenwald. So my grandfather and Wolfie, I suppose they were fortunate that they didn't have to stay on that train for very long in those horrible conditions. But as we go to the next slide, when they arrived at Buchenwald, my grandfather and Wolfie realized there was nothing fortunate about the situation that they were now in. They were greeted by vicious dogs barking and lunging at them. For my grandmother loved dogs, and so they always had dogs around their house, but my grandfather was always a little skittish around dogs, as a result of the way dogs were used at the concentration camp. And members of the SS were screaming out orders to them, telling everyone to move. I'm curious, if we go to the next slide, do any of the 6th and 7th graders know who the SS were? Does anyone want to give that a try? Maybe you've heard of the SS. They were an elite group of Nazis. They ran the concentration camp system. They were mostly guards and administrators, and they were particularly cruel. We'll talk a little bit more about them later in the way that concentration camps were run, but here's a photo of 4 members of the SS. The main gate at Buchenwald, the one pictured here, if we translate it, it said, "To each what he deserves." And this was important. It wasn't enough that the physical conditions at the concentration camp were unimaginably cruel. The Nazis also tried to wage psychological warfare on these prisoners. They tried to turn them against each other. And my grandfather, taking everything in, he was convinced there must have been some kind of mistake. He remembered pleading with the guards about this, but there must be, is this Buchenwald? There was a mistake. I'm in the wrong place. But they told him that he was in exactly the right place, that there is no other place called Buchenwald. And the cattle car had arrived at the camp late at night, so they were taken to the disinfection building. They were told to sleep on the floor there, and they would do all the official processing the next morning. My grandfather and Wolfie, they did their best to try to sleep. They had brought their warm winter coats with them. They were using those coats as pillows. And in the middle of the night, they were stirred, they were awakened, as another one of the prisoners, someone who had arrived at the camp without any possessions, was trying to steal Wolfie's coat from under his head while he was sleeping. And my grandfather, he called out for help. And someone who worked in that building came over to see what the commotion was about. And this was another really critical fork in the road moment, because the man who came over to investigate, if we go to the next slide, he was named Erwin Lippmann, and he was part of the active communist underground at Buchenwald. And he turned out to really be a guardian angel for my grandfather and Wolfie while they were imprisoned at Buchenwald. He looked out for them. Buchenwald, it was one of the first concentration camps that was established in Germany. It was established in July of 1937, before World War II even started. And most of the early prisoners at the camp actually weren't necessarily Jewish. They were either suspected or actual communists. They were political prisoners. And by the time my grandfather and Wolfie arrived at Buchenwald, there was a fairly large group of communist camp veterans who had been there for several years. And these prisoners were given administrative positions. They were given positions of power within the camp. This is part of how the Nazis operated these camps. The SS, they didn't have large enough numbers to operate these camps and do all the day-to-day responsibilities. So they used prisoners, they elevated certain prisoners in positions of power and forced them to actually administrate the operations of the camp. And some of these prisoners, they chose to use that power to help other prisoners, and they formed an informal underground organization which met in secret. Maybe you've heard the word underground before, right? It means something that's like happening in secret, that's like under the radar, but literally these groups would meet below the ground. They actually met in Buchenwald's sewer system, and they knew that it was safe to meet there because the SS the guards, they would never dare to go down there. It was a pretty, disgusting place. And it's hard to know exactly why Erwin Lippmann, his prisoner card is pictured here. It's hard to know why exactly he did so much to help my grandfather and Wolfie. We'll get into how he helped them in a few minutes. He probably helped many other people in Buchenwald as well. But one factor is that Lippmann was also born in Hamburg, so they had the same hometown, which was pretty far away elsewhere in Germany. And he was Jewish as well, so he was a Jewish communist. And Lippmann, he came over. Again, there was the commotion about the stolen jacket. That's why my grandfather had yelled out. So Lippmann, he came over and he explained to my grandfather that, don't worry about Wolfie's jacket. It would soon be confiscated. Prisoners aren't allowed to keep their clothes that they come with. They're only allowed to wear their official uniforms at Buchenwald. But they started talking a little bit, and he promised that he would try to do his best to help them while they were there. So if we go to the next slide, the next morning, my grandfather and Wolfie, they were officially processed as new prisoners at Buchenwald. And along with all the other incoming prisoners, their heads were shaved, any valuables they had were taken from them, and they were sprayed with disinfectant. So take a moment to imagine that human beings were being disinfected like they were animals so that no disease would spread. And they were completely stripped of their humanity. And a photo of my grandfather was taken. It's a remarkable thing that we actually have this photo that was taken at the time. It's a pretty haunting photo, but kind of, it shows a little bit of resilience as well, I think. And he was issued his prisoner card, which you see there, and he was given his prisoner number. So it was number 38156. He was given a fabric number. It was the number that's shown here. That was also something that he kept. And he had to sew that to his prisoner uniform. These numbers, it was part of the Nazi strategy to dehumanize concentration camp prisoners. As you may have heard, that you weren't a human being, you were just a number. And as you may know, in some concentration camps, these numbers were tattooed on the forearms of prisoners. So that happened at some concentration camps, but other concentration camps, like Buchenwald, it was just a fabric number that was sewn on to the uniform. And Buchenwald was part of a larger concentration camp system across the territory that the Nazis came to control in Europe. And as you may know, there were some camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, which maybe you've heard of. It had the purpose of extermination, of quickly killing prisoners shortly after arrival, while other camps were focused on forced labor. So Buchenwald was in that second category. It was a forced labor camp, primarily for men, but many of the prisoners there were literally worked to death, and the living conditions were unimaginable. And at Buchenwald, the Nazis imprisoned several persecuted populations. They imprisoned political prisoners like Erwin Lippmann, as I mentioned, as well as Jews and homosexuals, among others. If we go to the next slide, it's estimated that between 40,000 and 55,000 prisoners died at Buchenwald alone. And at first, my grandfather and Wolfie were placed in what was called the Little Camp at Buchenwald, with one of the buildings from that camp pictured here. This area of the camp, it was intended for prisoners who weren't healthy enough to work, mostly those who were being transferred from other concentration camps. And so diseases were particularly common in the little camp, and prisoners here received even less food than in the main part of the camp. They were seen to be less useful, less valuable because they weren't working. Have any of you heard of Elie Wiesel? Have any of you heard that name? Any of the kids? Maybe. I hear some yeses and some nods. So he wrote the book Night about his experience during the Holocaust. He spent time at a few different concentration camps, but he was living in the little camp while he was at Buchenwald. He's one of the prisoners in the photo. I have an arrow there pointed to where Elie Wiesel was in that photo. If we go to the next slide, after a short time, Erwin Lippmann was able to get my grandfather and Wolfie transferred to the main camp at Buchenwald, to Block 22, which was a Jewish block. And Wolfie was given a place to sleep on a crowded bench on one side of the building. My grandfather was on the other side of the building. But if we go to the next slide, looking back at that photo of the barrack, take a moment to just look at how crowded these shabby buildings were, calling them huts, maybe more accurate than calling them buildings. They had really thin walls. And you can see everyone was really just squeezed in like sardines with one prisoner on top of the other. Buchenwald, it was originally built in 1937 to hold 8,000 prisoners, but at its peak, the camp had 86,000 prisoners. So they had 10 times as many prisoners as there was supposed to be, and that's why there was so much crowding there. Meals were distributed only once per day in the evening. So prisoners were given a small amount of soup and a thin slice of stale bread after having eaten absolutely nothing for the entire day and having to work really hard. And, this was not some kind of like hearty soup with beans or other protein. It was pretty much just hot water with a tiny bit of flavoring. And my grandfather remembered that once in a while he got very lucky and would get some soup from the bottom of the pot, which included some potato skins maybe, and filled him up just a little bit more. These were the types of things that you would hear these stories from other concentration camp survivors, that they were just really obsessed with food, and the entire day it was really impossible to think about anything else. And even these small details like, oh, did I get soup from the good part of the pot versus the top of the pot? It was something that they would think a lot about throughout the day. And so really his most prominent memory from his time at Buchenwald was just constant hunger, finding it difficult to think about anything else besides that pain in his stomach. And, some prisoners like Erwin Lippmann, they looked after each other, but, given that everyone was just fighting to find a way to survive in these really horrible conditions, it was really every man or woman to himself to a pretty high degree. Now, roll call each morning, if we go to the next slide, it was absolute torture. The guards would methodically call out the numbers of each and every prisoner in the entire camp, one at a time. So when it got up to over 80,000 prisoners, as you can imagine, this took a very long time to call out all the names. And if we go to the next slide, some mornings the guards would make an example out of prisoners who had tried to escape the previous day. They would hang them in front of everyone else using the gallows that you see in this photo. This was a way to warn prisoners, don't even think about trying to escape. This is what will happen to you. If we go to the next slide, my grandfather was given a job working to create bricks out of clay. I was just thinking, we just had our Passover Seders where we had charoset as part of the Seder plate. And why do we do that? It's because it kind of represents the mortar, the bricks that were used for the creation of the buildings that the Jews in Egypt had to create. So there's some parallel here because my grandfather was creating bricks at Buchenwald. That was his job. Imagine being forced to do that at the age of 15. Some kids at that age in the Bay Area, they might be babysitting, maybe working at a summer camp over the summer. But at Buchenwald, the idea was to literally work and starve these prisoners to death. And the guards were constantly looking over your shoulder, yelling at you or punishing you if you weren't working hard enough or quickly enough. And the most dreaded punishment, we have a photo here of the quarry at Buchenwald. Actually, if we go back to the last one, the most dreaded punishment was to spend time working in the quarry. That was where prisoners had to pull these really heavy rocks in small carts, and that was as a punishment for some kind of infraction, maybe looking at an SS guard in the wrong way or not doing your normal job in the way that you were supposed to. As we go to the next slide, as the weather grew colder in the winter, the struggle to survive became even more desperate. Here's a photo of Buchenwald covered in some snow. And as you can see in this photo on the next slide, the prisoners' uniforms, they were really, really thin. They were they were more like pajamas than clothes. So they really didn't provide much protection from the freezing cold wind. And that was part of what made roll call so tough in the winter in particular, because it was so freezing cold. And they just had to stand still and wait for those numbers to be called. And I mentioned this earlier, the walls of the buildings where they slept were also just really, really thin. So didn't provide much protection from the wind. The wooden shoes that everyone had to wear, they weren't close to adequate to protect from the harsh cold. If we go to the next slide, in November, as the weather started to get colder, my grandfather sent this postcard to his grandmother, who had left Germany to move to Palestine, and we were able to recover. This is a photo of that actual postcard. Prisoners were, in some cases, able to send postcards, but they were screened to make sure there wasn't any mention of the horrible conditions. The Nazis didn't want the rest of the world to know that they were starving prisoners to death. And so the postcard which we have here, it read, I'll just read the translation: "Dearest Grandma and relatives, I was so happy to receive your letter. We are healthy." Maybe, who knows if that was actually true, but that was, the message in the postcard. He knew that he couldn't say exactly what was going on there, and then he finished, "Lots of kisses to Mom, right often, warmest wishes and kisses to the whole family." If we go to the next slide, about 5 weeks after my grandfather sent that postcard, he became very sick. I've mentioned roll call a couple of times. It was an important part of the concentration camp experience, because if someone didn't show up at roll call, they would most likely be killed or sent to another camp to be killed. And it became very difficult for my grandfather, because he was so sick, to make it out of block 22 in the morning and to stand for such a long time during roll call. And eventually he just couldn't do it. It became impossible. And this meant that my grandfather had no other choice but to go to the Buchenwald infirmary. And this was really a last resort, because the infirmary at Buchenwald, it wasn't like the nurse's office that you might have at school, or the type of infirmary that you may have at a summer camp. Anyone who showed up at the Buchenwald infirmary was at a really high risk of being sent away to be killed. Prisoners, they were considered useless if they couldn't work. Buchenwald was a work camp. And my grandfather had 2 visits to the infirmary that were recorded on this card here. We were able to get a copy of this card when we went back to Germany just a few years ago. And they kept records of everything. So there were records of his 2 visits to the infirmary for a lung infection at the end of December, and then he was at the infirmary again for the flu in February. And shortly after one of these visits, he was selected to be transferred to another camp, likely an extermination camp similar to Auschwitz. It was determined he was too sick, he couldn't work, and that would have likely meant he would have been killed. But this was another key fork in the road moment, because Erwin Lippmann, who was the Jewish prisoner from Hamburg, who was part of the communist underground, the man my grandfather had met his first night at Buchenwald when there was the incident with the coat, he was able to intervene to keep that transfer from happening, which likely saved his life, and my grandfather eventually recovered enough to be able to work again. So as the weather started to warm up in the spring of 1945, there was just a little bit of optimism in the air. There were rumors that were starting to circulate in the camp that Germany was losing the war. April 4th, 1945 was my grandfather's 16th birthday, and Erwin Lippmann gave him an extra portion of bread as a birthday present. But just a couple days later, as the American army started to advance close to Buchenwald, Germany was losing the war, the SS guards, they started to round up prisoners and march them in the opposite direction of the advancing troops. Historians, they call these marches death marches, because prisoners, they were forced to march by foot for miles and miles with no food, and those who could not keep up were simply shot. And more than 20,000 prisoners were marched out of Buchenwald at this time, out of Buchenwald and its sub-camps. There were smaller camps that were part of the Buchenwald system. And many prisoners then were taken on cattle cars on those trains again, and about a third of them didn't survive that march. And this was the final fork in the road moment for my grandfather and Wolfie, because they didn't go on that death march. Ahead of the death march, the SS, they first called for just the Jews at Buchenwald to gather in the roll call area. And that was unusual. It wasn't a typical SS order. There were a lot of Jews at Buchenwald, but the majority of the prisoners were not Jewish. So the fact that they were singling out the Jews was unusual. And my grandfather had a feeling that this was a signal that something bad was about to happen. So he went to Erwin Lippmann for advice. He was able to find him, and Lippmann helped my grandfather and Wolfie find a place to hide until the coast was clear in order to avoid that so-called death march. And I mentioned before that Erwin Lippmann and others in the communist underground, they would literally meet below ground. They would use Buchenwald sewers as a place to have secret meetings. They knew that the SS guards would never go to such a place. And so with Lippmann's guidance, my grandfather and Wolfie actually hid for a couple of days in that sewer system until the coast was clear. We can go to the next slide. And for obvious reasons, this was a part of my grandfather's story that always really featured very prominently for me. You can see it was highlighted in the Wall Street Journal obituary a couple of years ago when he passed away. It's kind of a vivid image of what he was forced to endure. The entire time at the concentration camp was very difficult, but those last couple of days, while it was a time of a lot of hope because of the rumors of the advancing Americans, it was also very, very difficult to be in those conditions. And so finally, on the morning of April 11th, 1945, if we go to the next slide, American troops moving east, they finally arrived at Buchenwald and freed the 20,000 or so prisoners that were still there. So about half of the camp was sent on the death march, about half of the camp had stayed and were liberated by the Americans. By this time, nearly all the remaining SS guards had run away. There weren't that many guards who, they didn't feel that they could confront the American army. They knew they had done very horrible things. They ran away. They didn't want to face the consequences. And the prisoners, they could hardly believe their eyes. And the soldiers who were liberating them, they couldn't believe what they were seeing either. And I'll just read this quote here. It's from General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a general in the U.S. military at the time. He later became president, so maybe you've heard his name before. So he said, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." So that was how horrible and visceral it was. Everything that they were seeing, it gave meaning, gave a new kind of meaning to the war. Buchenwald was the first major concentration camp that the American troops had discovered. And so the young troops were shocked. They were appalled by what they saw. The emaciated women and men, like the ones in these photos, staring at them on the other side of barbed wire. I try not to include any photos that were too graphic, but there was the horrible smell of dead prisoners who were just kind of, there wasn't even an effort to hide those dead prisoners. They were just, the bodies were there in a pile. And one of the first priorities was to try to provide some food for the prisoners. The prisoners, they were now free from their Nazi torturers, from the SS, but they were still in a very fragile condition. It wasn't just like, okay, you're free, everybody's fine, There was still a tricky time, and many of the soldiers, they went into their little bags, their pockets, they had some personal food items that they gave to the prisoners. You hear sometimes that chocolate bars were given. And one, really tragic thing is that some of the prisoners grew very sick and even died from this food because they were so starving, they were so desperate for food. They ate this food really quickly, and their digestive systems, their stomachs were used to eating this soup that had no nutritional value in them, so they couldn't really handle trying to digest normal food or food like chocolate with some amount of fat in it. And photos and stories from Buchenwald, they were distributed all around the world. The global community started to learn about the unimaginable things that happened in Nazi concentration camps, and this would continue. These stories would be shared as more and more concentration camps were liberated, including the extermination camps. And if we go to the next slide, this is something that I probably didn't ask my grandfather about when I was much younger. I didn't even think about it. But my grandfather and Wolfie, they spent another month or two at Buchenwald, kind of recuperating, getting themselves back to health after the American troops had arrived, just slowly getting stronger until they were well enough to travel. And one day there was a truck that was heading back to Hamburg, and my grandfather, Wolfie, and Erwin Lippmann, they journeyed back as part of a group to their hometown. And there they parted ways. And after a few weeks in Hamburg, my grandfather and Wolfie were able to get a bus to Sweden. And if we go to the next slide, when they finally made it to Sweden, we know the dates from some of the documents. It was September 25th, 1945. They had a detour in Copenhagen. They were reunited with their mother. She was in a total state of shock. She had been convinced that her sons were dead. She thought they had been killed by the Nazis. They were hardly recognizable to her. They had been young boys. They had been 9 years old and 8 years old when they had been separated from her about 6 years later. And then, as you can see here, the two eldest were young men by the time they were reunited, and they had somehow survived the horrible conditions at Buchenwald for almost a full year. And the war in Europe officially ended in May of 1945, but as my grandfather said in the video earlier, the trauma of the Holocaust, it didn't end at that point when they were liberated or when the war ended for folks like my grandfather and Wolfie who had lived through all of it. Yes, they were lucky to survive, but they would never be able to live a normal life after everything they had been through, after everything they had seen. And so before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to share a few photos from my trip back to Buchenwald with my grandfather. This was back in 2015, almost 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. And in the first picture, it shows the collection. Everyone in this photo was a survivor of Buchenwald. It was 80 or so folks who were there. They had all come back to Buchenwald to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the camp's liberation. And there were also a few of the soldiers who had been there to liberate Buchenwald who made the trip. And this next photo was taken the day before there was a really large ceremony commemorating the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Buchenwald. But my grandfather and I went a day early, along with my aunt and a cousin of mine. We went there to kind of just visit Buchenwald, to be there without the crowds that would be there the next day during the ceremony. And while we were waiting for my cousin to park, my grandfather, he noticed a group of students that were just kind of standing by the entrance. And we had him in a wheelchair that day, just to kind of preserve his energy. So he asked me to wheel him over to these students. You can see the photo here. He then spoke with them in German, and he told them, hey, I actually was here as a prisoner at Buchenwald, at this camp that you're here to see. And he answered several questions for them, questions that they had for him, rather. And this really just kind of encapsulates the way in which, in the last 20 years or so of his life especially, he really made a big effort to make sure that the younger generation, that folks like you, had an understanding of what prisoners like him went through in places like Buchenwald. He would also go once a year or so to speak at a local elementary school where he lived in upstate New York. And if we go to the next slide, what has really haunted him as much as the horrible conditions that he had to endure, it's the knowledge, he mentioned this in the video, that his friends from the orphanage, they were part of an estimated 1.5 million children and adolescents overall, among the 6 million killed. And this little video of him is in front of a memorial where Block 22, the Jewish block, once stood. That's where he had slept for most of his time at Buchenwald. And this memorial includes Psalm 78:6, which is a full text that I'll read in a second. My grandfather chose to place this rose on the word Kindern, though, which means children in German. And just to read the full text of that psalm for you, I think it's really relevant now, while there aren't that many Holocaust survivors who are still alive to tell their own story. I'll just read it for you. It's so that the children to come might know, the children yet to be born, that they too may rise and declare to their children. And so before I take some questions, I want to return to that key learning that I mentioned in the beginning. There's a tremendous power in seeing the humanity in others and acting to help those in need, just like Erwin Lippmann, the guardian angel, did, just like Emmanuel and Gertrude Seinfeld did, that married couple that treated my grandfather and Wolfie like their own kids. So regardless of what the government says or what terrible position you may be in yourself, and I hope that message will stick with you. And now I'll open it up to any questions that you may have.
Yeah, I just have a question about, I think this was your grandmother, was wrapped in burlap sack and tossed over the wall of the ghetto outside. So you didn't really follow up on anything. What happened there?
Yeah, she had a remarkable story too. She, as was a little more common, she really didn't like to talk about her story at all. My grandfather was like that for some time, but then, around that time that my aunt, who lives in the area, around the time my aunt was in high school, she did a project where she asked my grandfather a lot of questions, and that kind of started to get my grandfather to talk about it more. But yeah, my grandmother had a remarkable story too. We don't know all of the details, in the way that I was able to share my grandfather's story, but the broad outlines of the story are that she was from a pretty wealthy family. Her mom was a doctor, which is pretty unusual at that time. Her mom actually went to medical school in Germany. And because they were pretty well off, they were kind of in her broader family had some positions of authority within the ghetto, which came with a lot of difficult things that they had to be part of. And her mom, so I guess my great-grandmother, would smuggle things in and out of the ghetto generally. And so she knew some of the routes. And the story was that literally she had a necklace with some gold coins around the necklace. And they'd made prior arrangements. She was thrown over the wall in a burlap sack and was told to just keep walking until someone was going to meet her. And that's when she met this person related to the farmer who then took her to this farm where they were kept in hiding. And then it was some time, maybe weeks, maybe even months, until the rest of her family was able to come and join her there. And yeah, I think it was, yes, those farmers took a big risk to protect them, but my sense from my grandmother was always, there was a little bit of gratitude there, but also just this feeling that they weren't treated very well by the farmer, and they had to kind of they had some valuables that were hidden that they had to give very slowly over time. They didn't want to give everything right away because they didn't feel like they could really fully trust these people to keep them hidden. My grandmother's parents weren't really able to leave the building. My grandmother, she had some kind of light features. She didn't visibly look obviously Jewish, so she was able to spend some time outside a little bit. But those are kind of the broad outlines of the story. And their family ultimately went to Sweden after the war. So my grandparents met in Stockholm.
Great job today. Oh, thank you. What kind of relationship did your grandfather have with food after the war?
Yeah, it's a great question. He definitely had that kind of common experience of not wanting any food to be wasted. That was definitely the case for my mom and her siblings. It was a household where it wasn't acceptable to throw away any food. You had to finish what was on your plate. He had a lot of stomach problems starting in the middle of his life. He actually had to have a major surgery in his stomach and remove about 2/3 of his stomach. So he had to kind of be careful and not eat too much. But he was still able to enjoy certain foods. We had a very close relationship. We would talk on the phone almost every day, and towards the end of his life, I kind of introduced him to the food delivery services like Uber Eats and DoorDash, and would send him some tuna, kind of like this seared tuna dish from a local sushi place in upstate New York. But yeah, he definitely definitely did not have like a normal relationship with food after everything he had been through, and very possible that the stomach problems he had were related to his experience during the war at the camp. Or another funny thing is that he went back to Germany several times after he was liberated. The first time was only about 10 years later. There was on a business trip in the area, and he tried to kind of walk around some of the major cities nearby, and it was just way too soon, and he had to cut the trip short. But then, if you recall the photo with him in front of the school, that was from 1983, when he went on a trip with my aunt. And they also went to Buchenwald, which at the time was part of East Germany, controlled but it was still under the Soviet Union. Most of the time, from what I understand, every time he went back, there was some kind of like health problem that popped up. He passed a kidney stone one trip. He cracked a tooth one trip. So there were ways in which being back in Germany, reliving what he'd been through, it brought up symptoms and very real things in his body.
Did he ever see, was his name Erwin, the man who had helped him when he got to the camp after the war?
Yeah, so they were on this truck together back to Hamburg, and they kept in touch a little bit. Somehow my grandfather knew that he had emigrated to Argentina with his wife not too long after the war. But they didn't ever see each other again. When I was it was either high school or college, I got really interested in trying to track him down because he had played such a big role in saving them. Unfortunately, we weren't able to. We were able to. In Germany, they have these things called Stolpersteine, these stumbling stones that indicate on the street, Jewish families who used to live in certain houses that were sent to concentration camps and killed. And some of those records actually reference Erwin Littmann and his family. And so through some of that documentation, found out they actually moved back to Germany. In the early 1970s, I believe. And they had a daughter named Jutta Littmann. So I did a little sleuthing work, and there was a researcher in Germany who was trying to help see if we could track her down, but maybe she the daughter of Erwin Littmann, but maybe she got married and changed her last name, or it's hard to know. So we haven't been able to reconnect with them. But notably, there was that other couple, Emanuel and Gertrude Seinfeld. I was able to track down their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Just kind of found them on Facebook, and they were they had a daughter, Ava, that I mentioned. So Ava had several kids, and so those grandchildren of Emanuel and Gertrude all came to my grandfather's house, and we all had a Shabbat dinner together, which was pretty amazing. And they were kind of just comparing stories, and I think their story is also a reminder of how even for folks who didn't, I think it's deservedly the word Holocaust survivor is used in a pretty broad term. In a pretty broad way, there are folks who were in a concentration camp, but many people who weren't in concentration camps were impacted in really profound ways. And Ava Seinfeld, who was sent to England, is one of those people who unfortunately had a lot of mental health problems, a lot of mental illness. It was decided that she actually stayed in England. So even after the war, they reconnected. But her parents, who were really not in good shape financially at the time, kind of in consultation with others, made the difficult decision to say, she seems like she's doing pretty well in England. Maybe she's better off just staying there. And she was still pretty young at the time, but I think she maybe wanted to stay in England as well. And I think there was a huge amount of guilt later in life as a result. And so there was, I think like her children just really felt that, she had been through a lot as well. And, I think she, like my grandmother, didn't talk a lot about what had happened, but they were kind of doing their own research and learning more about that story. But it was pretty special for those descendants of the Seinfelds to meet my grandfather, and for him to be able to kind of say thank you for what their grandparents had did to help him and his brother. Any other questions? Oh, I see a question there.
Where did Wolfie end up settling?
So Wolfie had his own story. He was in Sweden for a little while. My grandparents ended up getting married in Haifa because they had kind of gone there to be with to what was still. So this was, I guess, they went there and they were married in I think it was 1952, or no, I guess it was maybe 50 or 51. So it was Israel then, and they had decided to. I'm going on a tangent, I guess, a little bit about my grandparents, but the deal was they would give it a try. They would try to live for 6 months in Israel. But my grandmother, who was like a little bit high maintenance, was like, I don't know about Israel. It was a pretty hard place to live in the early 50s. It wasn't very developed, and so they gave it a try for 6 months, but then left. But Wolfie he actually participated in the War of Independence in 1948-49. He wasn't a frontline soldier, but he was a mechanic, kind of behind the scenes, and he had a pretty different reaction. My grandfather, the orphanage where he had a pretty positive experience was a pretty religious place. It was like a somewhere between a conservative and an Orthodox orphanage. And so my grandfather, because of his experience there, he went to an Orthodox synagogue later in his life, and still, he was very involved in the Jewish community. But he wasn't someone who said, I definitely believe in God. For him, it was hard to imagine that an all-powerful, all-knowing God would have allowed all of his friends at the orphanage to be killed, would have allowed everything to happen that he saw firsthand at Buchenwald. Wolfie had a different reaction. Wolfie, the story is that there was a day when someone was being punished. There was something particularly brutal happening at the camp, and the story is that he's kind of promised himself that if he survived, he was going to devote his life to God. And so he participated in the war in Israel, and then he settled down in Bnei Brak in the Tel Aviv area and became a very, very observant Jew, and had I think 3 or 4 kids. Wolfie's still alive, had 3 or 4 kids, and then they all had like 7 or 8, 9 kids. And so I have many, many cousins in the Bnei Brak area who are descendants of Wolfie. And so that's a little bit of his story, and he and my grandfather continued to stay in touch and would try to talk, once every week or two including later in life, and they would speak in German to each other, interestingly. So my grandfather still, even though he had some negative associations, obviously, with the German language, he kind of, had some maybe mixed feelings about it, and still had some positive associations with speaking to his brother in that language that they had grown up with. I think she had her hand up first, more in the corner there. We had another question though too that we'll get to next.
What of the youngest brother? He had gone to Sweden early on, and mother followed. Were they reunited in Sweden during the war, or did she have to wait till the war was over? And where did he end up living?
Yeah. So Elliot, they were reunited in Sweden, and there was that photo where I didn't call this out, but if we go back to that photo, I don't know if Jeff is still able to do that, but he was in that photo. He was there. Something striking about that photo, you can kind of see that my great grandmother also just doesn't look super well in that photo. You can kind of see how I think she was pretty haunted by everything. Let's see if we can pull that one up. If we go back one more, you can see, yeah. So we were just there. Whoops, forward a little more, forward. But you can see that my grandfather is there in the corner, with a big smile on his face. Wolfie and Elliot are kind of smiling as well. 3 good-looking boys. But Rahel was just kind of looking straight ahead, almost, I don't know, there's something haunting about the way that she looks in that photo to me. So her story was a little bit different. There's a whole other thing where she ultimately had MS, and just had a really tough time, even after they were all reunited. And Elliot also, I think he had a family that treated him pretty well in Sweden. He didn't live with my great-grandmother during the war. He had a family that treated him pretty well, but he was also very much impacted by what happened. by being separated from his mom for some time. I think there was probably also just this dynamic where he had these two brothers who were maybe had a certain status that he didn't have because they had been through this thing that he didn't go through, and he had his own struggles with mental illness and some kind of gambling issues as well, and so he has a wonderful family that we're still in touch with, but yeah, he again. No, so he ultimately came to the U.S. He ultimately made his way to the U.S. I'm not sure exactly the year, but yeah. So no one really stayed in Sweden past the 1950s. Was there a question in the middle there?
I have the same question as Sarah, so.
Okay. Yeah, there was a question about survivor guilt, which was a common thing, and part of why some Holocaust survivors didn't like to talk about their stories. Part of it was they didn't want to relive the really tough things they'd been through, but also maybe this feeling of guilt of like, why did I survive when so many other people, so many other prisoners that I saw didn't survive? And my grandfather, he had some of that, but he was a remarkably optimistic guy. I think he really just had the mindset of, I was given, for whatever reason, I was given this opportunity, I was given the second chance, now I just have to make the most of my life. And so he really tried to, he definitely was a workaholic. He was very successful professionally, but he really immersed himself in his professional life and kind of had the mindset, I want to kind of do well financially in a way that would allow me to give back and donate to the Jewish community as a way to kind of make the world a better place.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Ezra and Rachel. For sharing this remarkable story of your family, your grandfather, your grandparents, and this is a story of the resilience of the Jewish people, and it's stories that we need to tell and retell. So I encourage you to share what you heard with people you trust, and as this way of honoring what our people have been through. And thank you so much for coming today.